explain again this important distinction. As far as a Jew is concerned, there is no distinction between one Jew and another in terms of their obligations. But what does make it different is their origin. One comes from Avraham Yitzchak Yaakov and the other comes from Erev. Technically speaking, there should have been no difference after many, many years. But something happened in history which makes a big difference. The Erev, as a multitude, did something. And because of what they did, they contaminated their neshamas. So that they differentiated themselves from the rest of the Jews for the rest of time. That's the critical thing. As far as the fact that they were accepted as Jews and that they all became Jews, that's all right. What happened was, something happened in history, and we will go into that, where the Erev did certain things, you see. And because of certain deeds that they did, they forced a distinction on themselves to forever separate them from the other Jews with respect to certain important features. Now, this is not a simple matter, you see. And when I mean the Erev, I don't mean every individual. I'm talking about the class in general, you see. Now, what we have to understand is, what did they do, number one, and how or what kind of nature did they develop at this point in time as a result? This is extremely important, because in order to understand modern day history, you must know this information. If you do not know this information, you cannot begin to understand what is going on out there right now, today, in 1987. Because we are now under the dominion of the Erev at its height. We are not any longer under the dominion of Esav in its height, in clear way. We have finally gotten down to the last shibud, or the last klipa, as they say. And this is the main force which dominates us. So we must learn who these people are, what they're about, you see, and how they operate. This is probably new to all the people, yeah?
Yeah.
What happened in history that suddenly created this concept or distinguished the Erev? We understand who the Erev is historically. But what happened in history to actually distinguish the Erev from the rest of the Jews? A very strange occurrence happened. And that occurrence has to do with a very, very powerful sin that the Jews did right after they got out of Egypt. And for all those who hasn't guessed yet, it is the sin of the golden calf. What's called Chet Ha'egel, the sin of the calf. Now, what was the story of the sin of the golden calf? How did it happen? Well, right after the Jews got out of Egypt, they went to what? They went to Sinai, Mount Sinai, and there the Baruch Hashem gave them the Torah, you see, the Ten Commandments and so on, which of course contain explicit prohibitions against idol worship, to believe in another god or other situations and so on. You're not to make any kind of image or any form or other gods or whatever have you. Fine. Shortly thereafter, this occurred on Shavuos, which is the 6th day of Sivan. On the 17th day of Tammuz, the 6th day of Sivan, right? Moshe went up for 40 days. And what happened was, he told the nation that he would be up there for 40 full days. He said, I'll be up there for 40 days. At the end of, on the 40th day, they all thought he was coming down. Suddenly they all looked up and they saw this incredible thing. They all looked up toward the top of the mountain and they saw this vision. And the vision was, they saw a coffin or a bier, and on the bier, like a bed was a corpse, and the corpse was Moshe Rabbeinu. They all saw it. They looked up and they all saw it. Well, it's obvious they all became extremely frightened, because Moshe was their leader. And they saw this vision that he was dead. So there's a tremendous controversy that went on what they should do. There's a tremendous controversy of what they should do. So what they decided to do was to build a golden calf. And what they did was they collected gold and all different ornaments from all the people, you see, and they put it together, and they threw in certain magical incantations, you see. They didn't fashion it. It was not done of any art and crafts. There was no goldsmith that did it. But there were certain magical incantations, certain things that they put into the fire, and suddenly the gold put itself in the shape of a calf. You see. And they took this calf and they said, this is the God that has taken us out of Egypt. That's what they did. Moshe was on top of the mountain, receiving the Torah, and then suddenly the Baruch Hashem says to him, go down. Lech reis, go down. Moshe was surprised. What's going on? And the Baruch Hashem says, go down because your nation has corrupted themselves. Your nation has corrupted themselves. That's what it is. Now here's a very, very important thing. We will get into what God explained to Moshe. Moshe goes down the mountain, takes Joshua with him, because Joshua was waiting at halfway in the mountain. He brings him down, and suddenly they see what's going on. They can't believe it. They can't believe what's going on. Right after Moshe receives the Ten Commandments, saying that you can't do these things, here they are, building themselves an idol. Astounding. So Moshe takes the two tablets which he has in his hands, right, and he throws it down to the ground and breaks it. And a plague breaks out and kills thousands of Jews who were involved in the sin of the golden calf. You see. There were other things also. The Levium then went ahead and they killed whoever was involved in the golden calf, but I don't want to get into the whole thing. Now, normally, when you hear the story, it's an amazing story. It's an incredible story. And what most people ask is this: why was God angry with the Jews? He was angry because they worship idols. But the amazing thing is they worship idols right after he told them that they're not supposed to worship idols. Now, the question that everyone asks, basically, is the following. Why were the Jews worshiping this? What happened? They just left Egypt and they all saw the power of God. They all saw these incredible miracles. They saw the whole might of Egypt destroyed, and they saw natural law completely subverted, you see. So if they saw all the stuff, and they went on the Red Sea, and they saw the Red Sea split 12 different ways for each tribe to go through. And they just received the Torah. They were all prophets. So they all heard, you see, the word of God. The first two commandments were given to every Jew, not to Moshe. They heard the first two commandments, each one. So they heard all this thing, you see. How could they then go ahead and build a golden calf? That is the most popular question, one of the most popular questions that are asked. And to make it stronger, if those Jews were not capable of what? Of holding back the temptation of idolatry, what does he expect from us? If all these Jews who saw everything that they saw were seduced by the Yetzer Hara for whatever reason, what chance do we have? That's one of the most famous questions of all time. I would like to add another thing. That who was the one who worshipped the golden calf? Really? Who was the one? Everybody worshipped the golden calf. Most of the people. But who came up with the bright idea to worship the golden calf, to make one and to worship it, and who went around trying to convince everyone? Erev. It was the Erev who conjured up the idea of a golden calf, who designed it and wanted it. And of course, once that happened, then the Jews fell in. But it was the Erev who came up with the idea and convinced the other Jews to go along with it. And they went along with it. Now, what's the difference in halacha between one and the other? If everyone worshipped the golden calf, or most people, what will be the difference? The difference is, one is called a chote. A chote is someone who transgresses a sin. And the other one is called a machta. A machta is somebody who gets another Jew to transgress a sin. In other words, you can either transgress it yourself, or you can go ahead and try and get other people to do the same sin you did. You see. Which is the worst category? The worst category is the one who seduces other Jews to do a sin. And it infuriates the Baruch Hashem to no end. Why? Simple. But if you want to do a sin, okay, but why do you have to schlep along everyone else? Why do you have to get other people to do the same sin as well? You see? Why do you have to do it? If you want to destroy yourself, that's your cheshbon. But why do you want to destroy other people as well? The Baruch Hashem says, if you want to destroy yourself, that's your choice, but why do you want to destroy my world with it? You see? You want to commit suicide, but why do you also want to commit homicide? Why do you want to kill someone else? So, with respect to the sin of the golden calf, the Jews were the transgressors, or what's called chote, and the Erev were machte, they seduced, or they caused the public to transgress, the other Jews. And that distinction was critical in halacha, you see, and it made an important distinction between the two. You see, what was the distinction? That the punishment of both would be different. Of course. You know where we find it? We find the same thing with the first sin, Adam and Chava. You see, who ate the tree, the fruit of the tree of good and Torah and Ra? Who ate? Both Adam and Chava. But who ate it first? And then who went over and convinced the other one? Chava ate it first, and then she went over to Adam and said, "Come, eat with me." That halachically made a total difference between Adam and Chava. So you will think that they both sinned, and therefore the travail and the problem that mankind has is because of both of them. Yes, it is. But because of the structure, the way that sin transpired, the punishment or the consequences were different for both. Adam was a choter. He was a transgressor. Chava was a machtas rabim. Chava seduced Adam, and not only did she seduce, she wanted to destroy Adam as well. That's why the punishment of woman is greater than the punishment of men. You should know. And it had very critical differences. I won't go into what that is. But there were very, very critical differences because of that. That's why there were certain mitzvahs in the Torah which help woman masaken or correct the sin of Chava. Specifically because she caused Adam to transgress. You see, lighting candles on Shabbos, Challah, certain specific mitzvahs are related to that. But women have a greater damage in the original sin than men. You see. And that's simply because of the halachic distinction. Now if it was vice versa, if Adam sinned and then he went ahead and he convinced Chava, men would have sustained the greater damage. But be as it may, that's essentially what happened. We find that when it came to the Chet Egel, this is what it was. I got all these backups, that's great. Let me explain a little bit about the Chet of the Egel, the sin of the golden calf. Although it will take us somewhat a far field, you see. I just want to explain a little bit of what happened at that point. What did the Jews do at that time? How could they have done what they did? I will amplify it on it later on. But let me just give some of the basic ideas. We know that when the Jews left Egypt and they went to Sinai to receive the Torah, the Mashiach was supposed to arrive then. God had no intention of continuing the exile after. That first redemption should have been the final redemption. It should have been the final redemption. The sin of the golden calf destroyed that possibility. When God said to Moshe, Lech Rei, go down, he didn't only mean go down physically, but he said to Moshe, go down spiritually, because Moshe Rabbeinu was the Mashiach. And when God said to Moshe, you are no longer Mashiach. That's what happened. Moshe was the Mashiach in his time. And we will understand much deeper later on why Moshe remained the Mashiach in a way, even for future times. But in that time, Moshe was the Mashiach, and he is the one who brought Jews out of Egypt. He was supposed to bring the Jews into Israel with the Torah, and that should have ushered in the true Messianic period. That's what should have happened. Because of the sin of the golden calf, You see, among other things, and also because of the sin of the spies, which we will get into a different time, it was stopped. It was stopped. So the Bnei Shem said to Moshe, go down. Go down from your status. You are no longer Mashiach. Because the nation in which you must help redeem is no longer worthy of the Mashiach. So you have lost it. And he said, go down because your nation has corrupted itself. You see, he didn't say because the Jews or the nation has corrupted. He said because Shichet is Amcha, your nation. So Rashi says right over there, your nation, the Erev. Why did God say your nation? Because it was your idea to bring these guys aboard ship. So God said because your nation has corrupted themselves, the Erev. Because they have not only done the sin of the golden calf, but they have dragged in all the other Jews as well. That's why. That's why this nation will not see the Messianic period. And that's why Moshe Rabbeinu died before he ever went to the land of Israel. Why? That was the main symbol. Because Moshe could not go into the land of Israel. Because if Moshe went into the land of Israel, the Messianic period would have started. And since he was no longer Mashiach, and that nation was no longer worthy, all the Jews died in the desert, and he died with them. You see. They have to wait for a future time for the Messianic period. But what did the Jews do? What did they do? The Jews were an iota away from the ultimate redemption. They were this much away, a tiny little bit from the ultimate redemption. Now, we know there are two ways that the Jews will receive the ultimate redemption, the Mashiach. There are two ways. One way is by virtue of their own efforts. If all the Jews of this time, now, suddenly did repentance, did tshuva, the Mashiach would arrive tomorrow. Today, he would come. That's what we know. There was once a man, a very famous man, who said to Eli Hanavi, he said, I would like to ask, well, there's a story that he said, I want to know when the Mashiach is coming. So he said, Eli Hanavi said to him, he's right over there. Ask him. So he went over to him, he saw this man who was binding his wounds, like bandages. He was putting on bandages, and then he took off the bandages and put on a new set of bandages, constantly. This all has meaning, we will discuss this at a different point in time. And he said to him, when is the Master coming? And the Mashiach said to him, today. The day went by and the Mashiach didn't arrive. So he went over to Eli Hanavi and says, how come the Mashiach didn't come? He didn't tell me the truth. He said, no, he told you the truth. He said, today, if you want it, Hayoim in B'Kol Tishmo. If you hearken to my voice, the Mashiach will come today. And he said, right, today I can come. Just like any other day. In other words, if you do tshuva, I will come. What happens if the Jews don't do tshuva? So what's the other option? The other option is that God says that I will bring them my way. And I told you what my way is. My way is that you will suffer in the hands of the Goyim through a persecution. If you don't take back your Kedusha, because what? Because you were not tempted by the seduction of the Goyim through your own efforts and bring the Mashiach, you will bring them down through persecution, through a real exile. But if you bring them down through a persecution, when will he come? Nobody knows. There is a certain fixed date in history. Nobody knows when that date is. That date is called a case. Case meaning the end, or the final day, which God says, this is the last day possible. The Mashiach must come by this day. If they don't come by your efforts, they will become by my process. Which means that the world will not go beyond that day without the Mashiach. You see. So the Jews have the ability to bring the Mashiach before his time, before that day, at any point in time in history. But if they fail, then he must come by a certain day. That's it. Two different ways. When the Jews went out of Egypt, and they were about to earn the Messianic period, that was a way of earning it. How? Through which effort? Through their own efforts. Because it was very, very far distance from the final day. The final day has still not arrived, because if the final day arrived, he would be here already. Which means that the final day which is destined, that last day in which he must come, and which no man but two men ever knew what that day was, Yaakov and Daniel. They were the only two men who ever knew what that day was. He has not come, which means that it depends on the Jews themselves. They were very close. They were about to bring the Mashiach. They were this close, a fraction of an inch away. You see. The Yetzer will run up to God and says, hey, wait a minute. 1 second. What's this Mashiach business all of a sudden? What do you mean you're taking away my Kedusha over here? So the Baruch Hashem says, because they almost want, they were in Egypt for 210 years. They did their work. It's true that they were seduced by certain aspects of Egypt, but they wanted the persecution and they did certain things. They accepted the Torah. I want to bring the Mashiach. So the Tzaddik says, what do you mean you want to bring the Mashiach? It's not yet ready. You want to bring the Mashiach how? By what you want to do? No, by what? Their efforts. So the Yetzer says, I have the right to test them one more time. One more time. And he was right. The Sultan was right. The Sultan said to God, one more time. And if I lose out now, they got it. You see. What was that one more time? Now what did the Sultan do? The Sultan did an amazing thing. You see. Suddenly, he created a vision of Moshe being dead on the pier, on top of the mountain. Now you may say, well, what kind of test is that? That's not fair. Wait a minute. What do you mean create a vision? What kind of test is that? You have to remember who these Jews were. They just left Egypt. They were people who were prophets. They were able to see prophetic visions. To them a vision was nothing. To us it's staggering. But after you left Egypt, what's a vision? The Talmud says that every Jew who left Egypt, even the small Jew, the maidservant, saw more in prophecy and saw greater things than what Ezekiel, the prophet, saw. The smallest Jew saw more at that point in time than among the biggest of the prophets, Yechezkel and Ezekiel. That's how big they were. You see. So therefore, the Sultan said, I have to test them in their own way. Since they are so high and they're capable of seeing these visions and prophetic things, I am allowed to test them through prophetic methods. So suddenly he saw, and they all saw, prophetically, this vision of Moshe being dead. Suddenly the Jews were frightened. They didn't know what's going on over here. What's going to be? So they all started thinking among themselves. What were they thinking among themselves? Now listen carefully. They were thinking the following. Wait a minute. Moshe's dead. But wait a minute. God told us that he would bring us out of Egypt and bring us to the land of Israel through Moshe Rabbeinu. We know that. That Moshe Rabbeinu is the Mashiach. There's no question about it. He is the man. He is the one who will pull us out of this shibud and bring us to our Eretz Yisrael. They all knew that. But then, see, that's because they knew what God said. The Baruch Hashem said that Moshe is my Erev. Avdi Moshe. Moshe is my servant. And he is my instrument. Only him. He is the Mashiach. Then they looked up there and they thought he was dead. So they didn't know what are you going to believe. They didn't know what to believe. Should they believe what their eyes saw? You see? Or should they believe what the Baruch Hashem told them? Now you may say, well, what's the choice? If their eyes see that, then why don't they follow what their eyes see? Because that's not the point. The people also knew that it's possible that vision would come from the Yetzer Hara. They knew that possibility. Because the Yetzer Hara has the power to do that. Just like the Yetzer Hara had the power to give the Egyptians the ability to do these things, he had the power to conjure up this image also, which means that they weren't certain if it was the Yetzer Hara or not. They weren't 100% certain. They saw this and they said to themselves, what is it? Is it true? Is it an emet? Or is it the Yetzer Hara? What is it? What kind of vision is it? You see. So they had to decide, was Moshe dead or not? Now, what happens if Moshe is dead? What would they do? Who's going to lead us to Israel? Who's going to lead us? What do you mean? Who's going to have the messianic power? They knew they couldn't go themselves. They knew that they had to have a spiritual beacon. You have to see who Moshe Rabbeinu was. Moshe Rabbeinu was the spiritual force. He was a light which had the ability to take them to Israel. They couldn't do it on their own. So what they said was the following. They knew, through the wisdom that they knew at that point, how to take that light of Moshe and to put it on top of an image. They knew how to create literally a Mashiach. Now that sounds strange to you. That's what they knew. They knew how to create a Mashiach, you see. Because, as you remember, as I've explained to you, the whole process of Avodah Zorah, idol worship. What is idol worship? The people at the time when they bowed down to idols, they weren't bowing down to stone. They knew at those times, we no longer have this wisdom. They understood how to pull down cosmic forces, you see. Because they understood, in the way that God controlled the world, they understood where the centers of cosmic force, where spiritual power lay. And they knew how to pull down that spiritual power and use it themselves. And the way they would do it, they would designate a certain object, you see. And in some mysterious way in which we do not know anymore, they can literally make that object the repository or the vessel of that power. And then by doing certain types of worship or certain types of rituals to that object, they can literally usurp and dominate that force for themselves. That was the power of idol worship. But what they wanted to do, they wanted to use the principle of idol worship to create an idol that would become the Mashiach. Incredible! What a twist! What a interesting turn of events! They knew how to do it. They knew how to pull down the messianic force and put it on top of an object, and then manipulate that object to make it produce the messianic thing, objectives. You see, this wasn't fiction. They understood how to do it because we don't know how to do it anymore. But they knew how to do these things in those times. Now, we look at the Jews again. What were they thinking? Here they saw that Moshe died, but they didn't know, right, whether or not what he was true or not. But they knew that if the thing was false, that Moshe was alive. You see. But if it wasn't false, if Moshe was dead, they knew how to replace him. They knew how to take down his power and put it on an object. They could do it, you see. This had nothing to do with idol worship as we know it, although that's what it appears in the story. This was nothing more than the ability to transfer the messianic power either to an individual or to an inanimate object. But when they're dealing with the messianic power, why was it that they were dealing between the messianic power? Because they were almost worthy of the redemption. So when the Yetzer says, I want to test them in one more way, he said, let me test them with the very power of the Mashiach itself. That's the last test I can give them before the end. You see, what kind of Messiah it was? Because this is the thing. They looked at the thing and they say, wait a minute, the Bonishim said that Moshe would lead us, which means that the Bonishim promised us that Moshe would have the messianic force. But here we see he's dead, you see. But at the same time, we see Moshe dead, but wait a minute, maybe this is nothing more than an image, nothing more than a vision from the Yetzer Hara. What should we do? What should we do? So you may think that it's simply an argument of cold reasoning. What does that have to do? Why is that a test? Because here it is. If the messianic power is in Moshe Rabbeinu, outside of them, then that messianic power is under the control of God. They have to submit to the will of God. But wait, if they can take that messianic power and put it on their own object, they can control it by themselves. They become like God. This is the test. You see, the test is in where does the messianic power lie? Does it lie where God said it lay, or does it lie where you want it to lie, where you will have a control? So they looked at the vision, and they now had the choice of either believing that it was a true vision or the false vision. And it depends. If they want to follow the will of God, they're really humble, and they really want to do the will of God, they will say, wait, God told us that Moshe is the messianic power, and he's not going to lie to us. And even though we see this, it's definitely from the Yetzer Hara. Because we believe what the Bonishim says, Vayaminu b'Hashem Moshe Abdoi. And they believed in what God and Moses and Aaron. You see. So these people really feared heaven. You see. And they believed in what the Bonishim said because that's what they wanted. They didn't want to dominate themselves. They wanted to do what was true and was right. They would realize that the vision in front of them was false. You see. And if the vision of them was false, obviously it's some kind of a test. But if really they would love the opportunity to do it themselves and create their own messianic force, it was an idolatry through the power of the Mashiach, not like everyone else. It was the highest form of idolatry ever conceived on the planet Earth. Because it was idolatry, it was the Mashiach in the form of an idol. You see. So the thing is, if they really wanted the power, the highest power granted to man, which is the Mashiach in the form of the idol, then they would say, Moshe is dead. They would rationalize it. They say, Moshe is dead. He's dead, we gotta do it ourselves. That was the test. The fundamental test was not whether they would believe if Moshe was dead or not, if they would believe in the vision or not. The test was, would they believe in the vision or the word of God? And that depended on what they wanted to think of themselves. If they themselves wanted to think in an arrogant way, they wanted to usurp the power, they wanted to be the kings, then they would what? They would reject Moshe and build their own Mashiach. But if they refuse, if they say we must submit to what the Banishim said, we must believe in what the Banishim said, this is some form of a test, then they would have denied the vision. What did the Erev do? The Erev said, build. Moshe is dead, build Mashiach. And the Jews thought about it, and they followed them. It says in Gracious, by Yosef, by the book of Yosef, or Hazinu, both, there are two places where Yaakov and Moshe blesses Israel. And in one of the places, the blessing of Yosef is the following. Yosef is called B'chol Shoyrei Hodaloi. Yosef is like an ox. Like an ox, like a shaw. Yosef is like an ox, or a shaw. He is like the firstborn of a shaw of an ox. That's what Yosef is symbolized by the ox. He's symbolized by it. The Jews took whatever magical thing they did and threw it to the fire. And how did the gold come out? Like a calf. Because that was the image that came out. Why? Because that is the symbolic image of the power of the Mashiach ben Yosef, which Moshe was. Now, I will not go into the whole process of Mashiach ben Yosef yet. It's not relevant at this point. You see, the distinction between Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David, we will get into that later. But suffice to say that the power that they were vying for was the power of the Mashiach ben Yosef, who is the central power of the redemption. The real power of the redemption, the Mashiach that we are all waiting for to take us out, is the Mashiach ben Yosef, not the Mashiach ben David. He is the one that we're waiting for. And that's who Moshe had the power of. You see, this was the trial of the golden calf. It wasn't the fact that the Jews suddenly went ahead and built an idol, you see. That they said to this ox, this calf, you took us out of Egypt. What do you mean you took us out of Egypt? What kind of idiot would say to a stone, you took us out of Egypt after everything that happened? The answer is you did take us out of Egypt. Meaning, the force which is imbued in you took us out of Egypt. The messianic power which redeemed us is now in that calf. So this force took us out of Egypt. It wasn't that they went over to this eagle, to this calf, and they said, you're an idol. They all started bowing down to idols when they all saw that. That's not what it was at all. They didn't bow down to any idols. They didn't suddenly construct idols and bow down to them like the Egyptians. They were beyond that. What they wanted to worship, what they wanted to have power over is the Mashiach itself. That's what they wanted. This was the highest expression of Avodah Zorah that has ever appeared on the planet Earth. The highest form, you see. Why did God test them with the very power of the Mashiach? Simple. Because they were right before the Messianic period. They were right on the threshold. And the Eitzah had nothing left in his bag. Everything was gone. So he ran up to the voice and says, let me test them one more time. What was that last time? Let me test them with the very thing that they're about to earn. They're about to earn the Messianic period. Let's see what kind of Mashiach they want. Let's test them with the Mashiach itself. Let's see when they're right about to have the process of the Mashiach, whether or not they will corrupt that process on their own. You see. So what he did was to tempt them with the very power of the Mashiach, to see if they would take the power of the Mashiach. How? Through the right way, by serving the Baruch Shem, by fearing God and realizing what the emes is, or they would take the power of the Mashiach and what? And attempt to promote it, or to complete it, by virtue of their own arrogance and their own manipulation. What kind of Mashiach do they want? You see, a Mashiach that they created, or Mashiach that the Baruch Shem created. And that was the final test. It was the greatest test. And it was the only test available. And they failed. So they lost the Messianic process. explained. A whole different story suddenly than the way we looked at it. You see. In other words, what we see is very important. You may read something in the Chumash, you may read a story in the Chumash, and you may read the literal translation of it, yet you will have no understanding of what really went on. Because what you must know is that these people were not like us, and what went on in the Torah and the Chumash is not what went on today. They were on a different level, and they were tested in different ways, you see. You cannot look at these stories in a simple or mundane fashion. There's an enormous depth here, and very deep mysteries about what these things happened to the Jews. But the bottom line, it doesn't matter. I don't care how high they were. The point was, they went through a test, just like we go through a test every day. They failed. And that's it. And because they failed, we lost out on the Messianic redemption at that point in time. What was the ultimate consequence? The ultimate consequence was that the Jews lost the Messianic time. But there was another consequence. The Erev. The Jews lost Mashiach themselves. But the Erev would lose far worse. Because it was their bright idea that started the whole mess. You see. And what happened was, a very strange thing happened. The Jews were subdivided into two different segments. Spiritually. You see. So that when the Jews would sin, they would go into different nations. And finally, when they would pull out the Kedusha from all the nations, and they would have a little bit Kedusha left, that last Kedusha would not go into a Gentile nation. It would go into the Jews themselves, but into the other segment. You see. And if the Jews sinned, meaning that if the Jews were descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the good Erev, there are also good parts of the Erev. There are many levels of Erev. But if those Jews, you see, who are really good Jews, but they're sinning and they're not worthy of the redemption, Jews who are descended from Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and Jews who are descended from Erev, but who are good Erev, you know what I mean? If those Jews sin, then what the punishment does is take that Kedusha and put it into the hands of their other Erev, the bad Erev, you see. That's it. Now what does that Erev do? What does that other Erev, what does the bad Erev do with the Kedusha that comes from the other part of the Jews? You see, it builds them up. And it gives them a power, just like it does the Goyim. You see. But there's a difference. There's a difference. When the Goyim have the power of the Jews, they attempt to take the Jews away from the Torah into materialism, into this world. You see. That's the essence of what the Goyim do. They say, forget about God, believe in the body. You see. When the Erev goes against the Jews, they say, forget about the Torah, it's all false. They try and destroy the soul of the Jew. Just like they tried to do it the first time. They said, forget about God, forget about his Mashiach. They write a false Torah and a false Mashiach. The essence or the essential seduction of the Erev is the ability to write a false Torah. Not to build up a materialism, but to write a false Torah and attempt to promote it among the Jews and say, this is your Torah. Just like the original Erev said, this is the God who took you out of Egypt, this is the Messiah that took you out of Egypt. You see, that's the essence of the Erev, that they have the ability to seduce other Jews. Where did they get the ability to seduce other Jews? From what they did before. Since the Erev at that time seduced the Jews away from the Mashiach, the power is given to the Erev throughout time to seduce the Jews away from the redemption. That's the power of the Erev. That is the desecration in which the Erev has inherited. You see, that makes them the vessel nation. They would be choter, they would transgress, but not only would they transgress, they would have a taiva or yetzorah to take someone else away. That's how you can tell the difference between an Erev and a regular Jew. A regular Jew just wants to sin. An Erev not only wants to sin, he wants to take everyone with him. That is the essential difference. The Yitzhak of an Erev is different than the Yitzhak of a regular Jew. You see. And where does that difference come? The difference comes from what happened a long time ago. The Yitzhak of a Jew in those days was to worship the ego. The Yitzhak of the Erev was to create the ego to get the Jews away from it. So therefore, that Yitzhak is what the Erev acquired and inherited in their neshamas, so that an Erev, or a real Erev, feels in himself that when he does a sin, he must take other people with him. Whereas when a Jew says, I do a sin, he does it himself and doesn't bother taking other Jews with him. You see, that is a difference in the Yitzhak between a Jew and the Yitzhak of an Erev. And because of that distance, it's a difference in the function. With the Erev would become the last seducers of the Jews away from the Torah. But the seduction of the Erev is different than the seduction of the Goyim. You see, just like Yitzhak, the Yitzhak of the Erev is to take a Jew away from Torah. That's his Yitzhak. How? By making a false Torah. Now, the question is, who is the Erev? Who is the ones that do it? Can we identify these people? Who is the Erev today that qualifies? Look around. Look around. And you'll begin to understand. Who is the Erev in America? Every Jew that sets himself up and says, go away from the Torah, these are the sins of the Erev. The Reformed, the conservative, every body of Jew that goes into the Torah, desecrates it, says the Torah is not written by God. You see, you can do whatever you want. We wrote it. Just like we built our Mashiach, we wrote it. You see, forget about the Torah. You can change whatever laws you want. This is the Erev. You see. If you ask yourself the interesting question, who is the main people that persecuted Jews today? Really? Outside of Russia. Do the Jews suffer outside of Russia? Do you see Jews under the hands of Goyim anymore suffering? No, not really. Except for Russia. You don't really see that anymore. The Jews in America, we're not suffering. The Jews in Israel, they're not suffering. So therefore, what's happening? What's the persecution we're experiencing? The answer is, we are now under the what? Under the Shibud of the Erev. In America, that Shibud is what? Are all the conservative, reform, reconstructionist movements that holds most of American Jewry in its sway. 30% of American Jews are reformed, 30% are conservative, and 30% have nothing to do with anything. 7-8% have to do with Orthodox. Where are 90% of the Jews? Who holds them? The Erev. The men, the rabbis who have gotten up, and the leaders of Jews who have gotten up to do everything possible to take Jews away. Where did they get their power from? From their old ancestors. And what is that power? Power is not to make a Jew's life miserable. The power is to give him a false Mashiach and to destroy his neshama. That's why, in a certain way, the power of the Erev is worse than the power of the Goyim. Because it's much more insidious. Because it's the next Jew who's doing it. It's one thing when a Goy is doing it, you say he's a Goy. But what happens when your next fellow Jew is doing it? You can't recognize it anymore. And not only he's doing it to your Torah, he's not making you miserable, he's not coming down on your head, he's doing it to your Torah. You see, him, that's the point. That is the Erev. We will go into this again much more deeply next week. But we have a much better understand who that last nation is, and why today the main vessel nation or vessel segment which persecutes the Jews, which attempts to destroy them, is the seduction of the Erev. Tonight we're going to discuss again a continuation of what we've been dealing with up to now, which has to do with the process of history, the process of the Hashgacha or providence in human history itself. And if you recall, we laid down a certain basic principle, and just to repeat the principle, it is the following: that when the Jews do certain sins, when they do certain types of sins, certain immediate consequences occur. And the essential consequence which occurs when the nation of Israel as a totality, collectively, do sin. Now, I don't want to get into the individual aspects, but collectively, when the nation of Israel is not worthy, then the Kedusha, or a certain power, a power of holiness that they should have by virtue of mitzvahs that they do, is lost. They're lost because they haven't done the mitzvahs. That Kedusha is not lost completely, but that Kedusha rather is held within a certain power, or the power of the Satan, the power of evil. Now the function of evil, or the function of the Satan, who is a Malach, who is the Malach supported by this power of evil is to seduce people away from Torah and mitzvahs. Mainly to seduce people away from God. When he is successful, then he takes the power that should have gone to the Jews and he keeps it himself. He holds it himself. What does he do with it? What happens is it makes him much stronger, and then he's able to come down and punish the Jews. He's able to inflict all kinds of suffering with the power that they gave him by virtue of the sins that they had. Now what the Baruch Hashem has set up is a slight alteration of that system. What it is that the nations of the world, the Goyim, the people who are not Jewish, because of their evil deeds, have connected or become very highly associated with this satanic force. In the sense that the power which impels their souls essentially comes from a satanic force. That doesn't mean that the Goyim are not capable of good. That's not true. But since the good that they're capable of, or the kind of good that they actually do, is much smaller than that which a Jew potentially is able to do, for most practical purposes, they are much closer to the power of Satan than the Jews are. What the Baruch Hashem has set up is a very strange system, as we explained, that the power of the Jews, when they sin, goes to the Satan, or the satanic force. That satanic force is connected to certain Goyim, Goyish nations. In this case, the Gentile nations which are descended from Esau. And what happens is, the Jews then descend into the nation of Esau, or they go into exile. Again, the Kedusha of the Jews is given to the Sultan and then is translated to the nations in which he is connected to. The Jews then descend into that nation, which has their power, and they have to submit to two different levels of trials. At the outset, and it's very clear to understand this, at the outset, the first thing the Jews have to do is to defy the seduction of that Gentile nation. What do I mean? Very, very important principle that I have never really stated as crystal clear as I'm going to state it now. But the import or the significance of the statement is very, very important. You ever look at, for example, America? You ever look outside America, the attraction of the American environment, the cultural milieu of America? Is it tremendously powerful? Just the opportunities which are available, the materialism, the science, the technology, it's incredible what's out there. It's like you can have the most advanced level of life by living in America. Where does America get that power? Where does it get the power? Where does the Goyim of America have the power to create what's called the American way of life? The answer is, they get it from the Jews. Now that sounds strange, but this is the essential principle. The power which is invested in the Jews, and which they should have for themselves, they lose. The power is then transferred to a specific nation, to one or more specific nations, certain types of Goyim who are descended from Esau. What does that Goyish nation do with that power? How does it manifest itself in the Goyish nation? What happens is that the Kedusha spills over and infiltrates the entire society of that Goyim, so that those Goyim suddenly become very great in wisdom, in intellectual efforts, in science and technology. They become very great in economic prosperity. And suddenly the culture which is associated with that nation becomes quite sophisticated and very, very desirable. But where are the Goyim taking the power to suddenly rise so high? The answer is, it's coming from the inflated Kedusha which is given to them for the Jews. Which means that when you see a Goyish nation suddenly go up on the scale and really become very successful and very prosperous, that Kedusha which they suddenly got, because that's the power of Kedusha. Kedusha gives life, it gives success, and it gives wisdom. That's what it imparts. When it goes into the hands of a Goyish nation, suddenly it affects the entire environment, so that the cultural milieu, or the society of the Goyim, begins to reflect very great achievements. Where are they getting these achievements from? From the Kedusha that really comes from the Jews. Now what happens is, the Jews then go into that nation, which now has their Kedusha, transformed into social or cultural milieu. Why do the Jews go into that nation? To take that Kedusha back. Since the Jews were not able to hold that Kedusha on their own, you see, because of their own deeds, they have to go indirectly and get it back. From where? From the Goyish nation, from the Gentile nation, which has absorbed that Kedusha. Now how do the Jews get it back? How? Two ways. One of two ways. If one way is successful, then the second way is cancelled. If the first way is not successful, then God applies the second way. One of these two ways. The first way is very basic. The Jews go into that nation and they live there. They live there in peace with Gentiles. And what happens is the Jews suddenly look around and they see this incredible culture. They see all these Yitzhahorot. They see all the seductions. They see this great way of life that this Gentile nation now has to offer them. And this way of life says, forget about the Torah. Forget about it. Come to us. Come to us and do what we do. So what you see is an amazing thing. What happens is that the Kedusha of the Jews is now used to promote the darkness of the nation. You see. The darkness which that nation, that Goyish nation lives. The distance from spirituality which that Goyish nation has. You see. Now becomes inspired by the Kedusha which is buried in it. So suddenly, that darkness becomes a seductive force for the Jews. If the Jews refuse to acknowledge that's the side of the Goyim, if the Jews say, wait, we see what you have is an incredible culture, but we don't want anything to do with it because it's not the culture that we want. Your culture is nothing more than my Kedusha in darkness. I want my Kedusha back for me so that I can have it in spirituality. I don't want my Kedusha bolstering your materialism. I want my Kedusha to bolster my spirituality. So that's really the choice of the Jews. But if the Jew understands that the materialistic seduction and the opportunities of a Gentile nation is really the Kedusha of a Jew in the Gentile nation, he would realize that it's his own power which is seducing him in a different way. But it's his own power. If he sustains it, if he refuses to acknowledge it, he refuses to bend to the will and to the temptations of that Gentile nation, to the culture, to the society, to the technology, to the achievements of that Gentile nation, a very strange thing happens. The force of that mysterious nefesh, the power of that restraint, begins to slowly pull out the Kedusha from that Gentile nation, and it begins to pull it back to the Jews. What happens is the Jews then free themselves from the exile in that nation, and they go out. They're released or they're redeemed. And then that Gentile nation, having just lost its Kedusha back to the Jews, becomes what it was originally. Another Gentile nation without much Kedusha. You see. And it instantly goes into a cultural decline. If you will observe history, you will find it happen constantly, where the Jews go into a nation, and if they sustain themselves, if they refuse to obey the temptations of that nation, then the Jews are become worthy of redemption, and they are freed from that nation, and that nation declines. That's the principle. And I cannot overemphasize the importance of this principle. It's one of the most important Yesodis or principles that you will ever hear. And what is that? You will hear this principle, that the temptation, you see, of any Gentile nation in which the Jews find themselves, you see, that temptation is the Kedusha of the Torah itself in the darkness of the Gentile nation. The Jew is being seduced by his own power. It is the job of the Jew to take it back. Now, what happens if the Jews are deceived? And let's say the Jews therefore fail to observe the Torah. What happens if they run after the Goyim and they say, let us be like the nations of the world. Let's be like the Goyim. They have something great. They've achieved incredible things. We want to be like them too. We want to be like the Goyim. What happens? Then in that case, having failed to do that, you see, they fail therefore to take back their Kedusha. But since they allow themselves, to be seduced by the Goyish nation, they lose even more Kedusha to that nation. That added Kedusha that nation gets suddenly turns into a different concept. And here's the thing. If the Jews fail to restrain themselves against the seduction of the nation they find themselves, then that nation takes added power and begins to persecute the Jews physically. It begins to make their life miserable. That's the second step. You see. In other words, what's happening now, first the Gentile nation was only a temptation. Now it's no longer a temptation. Now the Kedusha of the Jews in the hands of the Gentile nations are going to give them power, physical, military power. And it's going to make them begin to hate the Jews. When that happens, they're going to begin to turn on the Jew as an enemy. And the Jews will begin to suffer at the hands of that nation. What will the Jews gain by suffering? Because when the Jews begin to suffer at the hands of that nation, they begin to pull back the power of that Galatian nation. You see. Until they suffer enough, where that Gentile nation would have lost all its power. And the Jews will be redeemed. And that Gentile nation will go into decline. So we see, that essentially the process is the same. You see. In other words, what God says is that the Jews must take back their Kedusha. God says, I will see to it. That's what God promised Avram. I will see to it that the Jews will redeem their Kedusha. One way or another. One way or another they will redeem it. What I will do is I will take their Kedusha and I will put it into a Gentile nation and I will let that power seduce them. They have the choice. They can take back their Kedusha in one of two ways. If they restrain themselves, if they hold themselves back against the seduction of that nation, against that Kedusha, that holiness which exists in the Gentile nation, which is their holiness, in the power of the Gentile nation and the power of darkness, then they will take back that Kedusha and leave without harm. But if they refuse, if they follow the Gentile nation and they fall, then they will take back the Kedusha, true, but only with persecution. In either way they will take back the Kedusha, but they can do it either through their mitzvahs, through their deeds, through their free will, or they will do it against their free will, involuntarily, by being persecuted by that nation. But one way or the other, they will take back the Kedusha. The choice is theirs. That's exactly what happened in the first instance of this particular mechanism in Egypt. When the Jews went down to Egypt, do you remember the old story when the Jews went into Egypt? Well, we just finished on Pesach. When the Jews went into Egypt, what happened? They went to Egypt, and Egypt was the mightiest nation on earth. Where did they get all the power from? That power came from the Kedusha of the whole world wrapped up in Egypt. It was the Kedusha that really belonged to the Jews and that the Jews should have taken back. It belonged to the Jews because they owned the Kedusha of the world. And Egypt became the bank, the repository, or the safety deposit box for that Kedusha. So God said to the Jews, I'm going to put you into Egypt, and I want you to take back that Kedusha. And I want you to have that Kedusha, you see. But again, I give you the choice. So when the Jews first went into Egypt, they weren't in slavery. Or do you read that the Jews were in slavery? It was not true in the beginning. In the beginning, they were like everyone else, you see. And what the Bonishim said is, don't be seduced by Egypt. Even though Egypt has the Kedusha of the world, and Egypt is capable of seducing you with their idol worship and with their magic, and with the powers of their passions and their seduction, and everything they have, with their gashmis, their materialism. Don't fall. But the Jews fell. So when God saw the Jews fell, the Bonishim says, okay, now I will have to take you out on different terms. Then the persecution starts. So the actual slavery of Egypt, the actual fact that the Jews became slaves in Egypt, in persecution, was only the last 80 years out of the 210. You see, for the first 100 and what? For the first 130 years, the Jews were not in slavery in Egypt. Only when the second alternative became the viable one. You see, and they had to be in slavery for 80 years before finally they were able to pull out enough of the holiness from Egypt, the Kedusha, which is buried in the tumor, on the impurity of Egypt, so they could be redeemed. And then what happened to Egypt after the Jews left? Does anyone know anything about history, ancient history? The Jews left in about 1248, 1250 BCE. Egypt declined shortly thereafter. It took them another several hundred years, another 500-600 years to really begin to decline. But never again was Egypt great. Egypt was at its height in the time of what? In the time of when the Jews were there, in the time of Ramses. Ramses the Great, and Mereneptah, and Seti, and Thutmose. These were the greatest pharaohs of Egypt. And that's when Joseph and Yosef and his brothers, and the Jews were there. Once the Jews left, and they had their Kedusha, Egypt went downhill. And you will find that's the same over every nation, like in Spain in 1492. In the 15th century, in 1400, Spain was one of the greatest nations on earth. You see, we don't remember this anymore because Spain is long since gone. But in the 1400s, who were the conquistadors? Who were the men that went out to the New World and discovered all the places in the New World? America, Spain and Portugal. They had the Kedusha of the world, not England and France. Spain and Portugal were the most powerful nations in the world at that time. And then what happened? The Jews suffered there, and then the Jews left in 1492 in the Spanish exile. The Spanish threw the Jews out. Once the Jews went out, the Kedusha went with them. And shortly thereafter, I believe in 1516, which is only what? 24 years later, England went to war with Spain, and Spain lost. The Spanish Armada was destroyed. And never again was Spain a world power. Again, you will find this in one instance after another. The Jews will stay in a certain nation for a certain while, and they will undergo the tribulations of either to restrict seduction, or to be persecuted. But once they leave, that nation will follow its decline. And that's essentially what happens here. So it's critical to understand this principle, that there are two steps to this. There are two possibilities of that. The Jews take back the Kedusha either by what? By denying the seductive power of the Gentile nations, by denying that darkness which they seek, and realizing what it is, realizing that it's their power, it's their Kedusha in the hands of Satan, attempting to seduce them. You see, Satan doesn't take, the Esau doesn't take the power of seduction from somewhere else, he takes it from the Jews themselves. And he attempts to say, this power will separate you from God, will free you from God, and will make you a nation unto yourself. But it's really their power, and they can either take it back in one of these two different directions. Where do we see a classic example? Where do we see a classic example that if a person suddenly restrains himself against certain sins, he pulls back the Kedusha of a Gentile nation? The classic example of that case was Joseph. Joseph, when he was 17 years old, was sold by his brothers in Egypt, right? He was sold, and he was one Jew, one person, that's all, went to Egypt all by himself, all alone. And he encountered one seduction after another until he had that incident with the wife of Potiphar, which he withheld himself, and so on. What happened? He sustained himself. He held himself in check against the power of Egypt, against the power of their temptation and their seduction. He did that. What happened then? Suddenly, in one day, he was taken out of the prison, and he was made the Prime Minister of Egypt. Now, how did Joseph become the Prime Minister of Egypt in one day? How did that happen? Where did that's uncanny. Where did Joseph suddenly get the clear? The answer is because the ability of Egypt to keep Joseph in the prison, in prison as a slave, was the fact that the Kedusha was in the hands of Egypt. But by holding back, by refusing to submit himself to the temptation of Egypt, Egypt lost that power over Yosef, and then Yosef gained the power of the Egyptians. Because in the next 14 years, Joseph told the Egyptians what to do, not vice versa. Because he's the one who made the whole plan. He told the Egyptians to bring their food, because he was the one who organized the entire situation about the fast. And then the Egyptians came begging him for food. He had the food, the grains of Egypt, the grain of Egypt. You see, Joseph ran the triumph like a boss runs a company. Where did he get that power from? He used to be the slave. He got that power not because he was Joseph. He didn't get that power because the Buddhism gave him that power. Buddhism was indirectly involved. Joseph got the power because of himself. He refused to go along with the temptation of Egypt. So he snapped, he stood, their Kedusha, and then he was their employer. That's what it is. But what happens is that all this takes place on a spiritual level, you see. When Joseph refused to go against the seduction of Egypt, what happened? You didn't see an actual switch of Kedusha, you can't see that. But in the Shemayim, in the spiritual world, an actual transfer took place from one bank to another. There was a bank called Egypt and there was a bank called Yosef. And the Kedusha, the bank of Egypt, transferred its account over to the bank of Yosef. But when that finally bank of Yosef got the Kedusha of Egypt, it filtered down to the physical world. And it translated itself into the process where Yosef was released from prison and became Prime Minister. You see, that's what happened. Which means that whatever happens in the spiritual world in terms of this constant battle of who has the Kedusha and who has the power, when that happens, it then comes down to the world and translates itself in an actual change or shift of power. When you see that one nation gains power of another, it's because suddenly it has the kedusha that other nation once had. That's where it's all at, you see. If you think money is power, money is not power. Kedusha is power. And whoever controls kedusha controls the universe. That's really what it is. Although it doesn't seem to be that way, you see. If you think money is power, you see, it appears that way. You know why? Because money is the front of kedusha in this world. But it's kedusha behind it. That's what makes the money so powerful. Take away the money, or rather take away the kedusha, and the whole thing crashes. You have the wealth. That's really what it is. It's kedusha masquerading as olam hazeh, as a physical, materialistic existence, masquerading so that it hides from you and says, come, take me in the form of the masquerade. And that's a deadly mistake. If you refuse to do that, if you can disconnect yourself from that kedusha in its mass form, in its hidden form, and you sustain and you connect to the B'nai Shalom through the mitzvahs and through a relationship with Him by doing His will, what happens is that mass falls apart and the kedusha is released and it goes to you in its pure form, and then you dominate the world. How will the Jews be zochah to the Mashiach in the end? What's suddenly going to snap the whole thing and the Jews are going to leave all the Gentiles, they're going to leave the whole exile, and suddenly they're going to go over to Israel? By the exact process I've just described. There will come a moment in history, when suddenly the bank account of the Goyim will be empty, and the bank account of the Jews suddenly will be full. At that moment, suddenly the Goyim will lose power, and the Jews will sustain the power for redemption. And that's when the Mashiach will arrive. That is the spiritual preceding activity which will bring the Mashiach. The Mashiach cannot arrive until that bank account has been transferred. That's what's holding him back. Every time we run after the American environment and we run after these things and we deceive ourselves, we don't recognize the kedusha in its masquerade form. Every time we do that, we deposit kedusha into the goyish account, into their bank account, and it allows them to retain power over us. Every time we say no, every time we say N-O no to them, we deplete, we withdraw from that account, and we put it our own. And at a certain point in time, when we will have drawn enough, the Jews will take dominion over the world, and that will herald the entire Messianic kingdom. I wish, although it's not possible, I wish that for one moment I can strip one achievement out there, one American power, and show you the kedusha behind it. If you just saw it one time, you would never again run after it, because you would see the incredible deception being played on you. You see, that's the biggest thing. In the end, the Yetzer is having a field day up there. The Yetzer, throughout time, dances. He does an incredible dance. He has an enormous band, and he's constantly dancing around in glee. He dances. You know why he's dancing? He's not dancing, you see, because he is more powerful than you, and he is. He's not dancing because he has all our kedusha. That's not why he's dancing, although that would be a very good reason. He's dancing because he has our kedusha, because we gave it to him, we gave it away, because he's able to fool us and make us think that by taking kedusha with the masquerade in some way we're running away from God, without ever realizing that we are rebelling against God by taking the power of God. That's why he's laughing, you see. That's the biggest simcha that they have up there. It's not only the conquest, it's the deception behind the conquest. Therein lies his real simcha. And that's why I say to you, I wish it were possible in some way to divest that power, you see, and to show you it only once, you see, and never again would you be fooled. But right now, you'll simply have to understand the hashkaf of it. You know, the thoughts, what I'm saying, the ideas and the principles. But this is what it is. He who controls the kedusha controls the world, you see. And that's the only way it is. If you want power, if that's what you want, take it. But take it the right way. Take a power which will go on forever. don't take a power which will be depleted and which will become absent. Sure, you want to be power hungry? Be power hungry. You want to be rich? Be rich. The Buddhism says, I allow you every one of your Yetzer. You want to be rich? Fine, but be rich in Kedusha. You want to be happy? But be happy in Kedusha. Be happy in a power and in a wealth, in a joy which will last forever. Not in something which will not last. Because Kedusha will not be buried in this tumah, in this masquerade for long. The Buddhism says there will come a time when I will unmask this charade. It will not happen forever, you see. And when that is unmasked, it is over, and it will have been too late. A quick review of history. Now that you understand the basic principle in a greater, clearer way, let's look at what the situation is. When the Jews sin collectively and their Kedusha goes into a nation, which nation does get those things? Well, as we've said, we've investigated this question, and essentially over history we find various different nations that have become what's called vessels for the Kedusha of the Jews. The first one was the Egyptians. And after the Jews left Egypt, Egypt was never again a vessel nation. The next one were the Babylonians. When I mean, these are the major ones that became vessel nations. And when I say major, they're major in the sense that they have the ability to conquer the world. The next one were the Babylonians. The Babylonians destroyed the first temple. Nebuchadnezzar also conquered the world. They had an incredible Kedusha of the Jews. That's why they also come and destroy the temple. What do you think Nebuchadnezzar, what do you think he takes his power to destroy the temple? You think anyone can walk in? If a Jew would walk into the temple without following the halachas, he would instantly die. So how can Nebuchadnezzar walk in and take over the temple? Only because the Shekhinah had already left. Because it was already in the hands of Babel in Babylonia. You see, the Shekhinah imparted the power to Babylonia to destroy the temple. There was a switch from the Jewish account into the Babylonian account. Next, Persians. The Persians conquered the Babylonians, the Persians and the Medes. And in the time of the Persians, they were the vessel nation, and that was the story of Purim. After that, Greece became the vessel nation under Alexander. And then under Antiochus. And that's the story of Hanukkah. Finally, Rome. Asia, the most powerful vessel nation that was ever created. And the vessel nation in which we right now are in exile. Because Rome transformed itself into Christianity. Rome became Christian. Christianity is the spiritual heir of ancient Rome. Ishmael, the Arabs, they became vessel nations. Not as powerful as Rome, but in certain cases they were also vessel nations. The rule is that the Jews go from one vessel nation to another. You see that? In a progressive form. Once they leave a vessel nation, they don't go back. They go on to the next one. Now there are reasons why they go into each one. You see, in each generation, depending on the kinds of Jews that live and the kinds of things they do, that will determine the nature of the vessel nation which will hold their Kedusha. And there's a direct correlation between the two. The Jews can only go into a certain kind of nation. No Jew gets transformed or exiled to any nation on earth. He can only go into the nation which is the vessel nation. If a nation cannot become a vessel nation, the Jews do not go into that nation. The Orient, the East, China, India, Japan, all these countries, if you'll notice, there's never been a Jewish exile in these countries for any real practical purpose. Why not? Because these countries do not have the spiritual capacity to be a vessel nation. And since they don't have the spiritual capacity to be a vessel nation, the Jews have no business in those nations. Because the Jews go into exile only when they follow their Kedusha. They follow the rainbow, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, their pot of gold. And they've got to go into the nation that has their pot of gold and take it back. The East, the Orient has never been vessel nations which will hold it. It has been ordained that essentially the Jews will have to go into a certain number of vessel nations. The last vessel nation that the Jews have to go into is Rome. When the Jews begin to break the back of Rome, meaning when the exiles of the Romans begin to die, then the Jews come very close to the ultimate redemption. Because God has ordained that the last true vessel nation will be Rome. Means all the nations of the world that have to do with Asia. The West, Western Europe, Russia, Latin American countries, these are Asia as it is today. As I had spoken about last time, World War II, with the persecution by the Nazis of the Jews, was the last great persecution of Asia. Because after that, the Jews never again are an absolute dominion in those countries. They have established their own country in Eretz Israel, even though it's not a firm country. But in any sense, the Jews have been freed by the total, the absolute dominion of Asia. Now the Jews in Israel have to worry about the Arabs. This is the vessel nation which is tormenting the state of Israel, the Arabs. And the Arabs are tormenting Israel because the great deal of the Kedusha of the Jews still lies in their Arab nations. But it's lower than Asia. Now, right before the end, right before the Mashiach comes, there is one more vessel nation. It is the last one. It is the last one before the Mashiach arrives. When the Jews go into that vessel nation and they sustain themselves either through the seductive power of that vessel nation, you see, or the difficulties that vessel nation will do, that will be it. The Baruch Hashem has said that after that will come the Messianic redemption. What I'd like to talk about is that last vessel nation. You see, the last one. Who is that last vessel nation? Where is it? How can we recognize it? And can we see ourselves slowly getting out of it? That last vessel nation is called in English the mixed multitude, or in Hebrew it's called the Erev. Now, who is the Erev? The Erev are fellow Jews. Sounds strange, doesn't it? Because I was just speaking about a vessel nation. So you all assume that a vessel nation is Goyim. Not so. Jews. In other words, the Jews today, if you look at all the Jews who live today, all the Jews who live today are already composed of two different subunits. Let me see. Two different subunits make up Jews today. And I don't mean people who live in one country or another. I'm not talking about Sfardim and Ashkenazim. I'm not talking about what Hasidim and Messiahim. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, because these are not major divisions of Jews, these are minor divisions of Jews. But there are two major divisions of Jews in terms of the classification of their souls, or the neshamas. And that classification is an extremely important one when it comes to the ultimate Messianic redemption. Incredibly important. Because that's the thing which is preventing us from reaching the Messianic period. What am I talking about? In order to understand this, we have to go back into history. A long, long time ago. When? When the Jews were in Egypt. When the Jews were in Egypt, right? Where did they come from? They came from Jacob. They were descended from Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Right? From our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yaakov went into Egypt with his 12 sons, and the Jewish nation was born. Until finally, by the time the redemption of Egypt occurred, there were 600,000 male Jews over 21, and another 1.5 million women and children. So the nation had about 2 million people that left Egypt in the time of the redemption of Egypt. In addition to them, somebody else left Egypt with them. And who was that? You remember I told you a long time ago, I told you that when God wanted to choose the Jews, He gave them a choice. When the Jews were in Egypt, a very strange thing happened. I don't know if I told you, I did. If you recall, the Bereshit told Avraham that he's going to create two segments of humanity. One segment will be the Jews, and the other one will be Gentiles, the Goyim. And he said, I'm going to put the purpose of the world into your hands. You will continue what Adam and Rishon, the first man, should have done. You and your children will continue it, which is what? Which is to transform the physical world into a spiritual world. Just to mention it again, the Kedusha, or the power that comes from mitzvah, gives you a very interesting ability. It gives you the ability to change physical reality into a spiritual world. That power which is what's being bandied about with the Goyim and the Jews, is the power to create endurance, the power to create eternity. That's really the power of Olam Haba, of the future world. When the Jews do mitzvahs, they acquire the power themselves. When they do sins, they give it away to the Goyim. But it's the power to create eternal life. Because the nations of the world sinned at the time of Avraham, God said, I'm going to separate mankind so that only the Jews will retain that power and the Goyim will no longer have it. But I'm going to take away that power when I take the Jews out of Egypt. Until then, I will still let some of it remain by the Goyim. When the Jews left Egypt and they went to the mountains, to Har Sinai, to receive the Torah, God went around to all the nations of the world and offered them the Torah too. He said, take the Torah. They all turned them down. But the Bible says, take this power. Don't relinquish it. They said, no, we don't want this power. We'd rather have this world. We'd rather have the power in a masquerade form. We feel better about it because it'll give us a sense of independence and a sense of that we are our own boss. We don't want to submit to somebody. We don't want someone telling us what to do. So the Bible says, because of that, they will lose that power forever and only the Jews will have it. All the nations of the world turned down the offer that God made except the Jews. That's why the Jews continue with that power, and the Jews are the ones who will ultimately bring this world to what? To a perfected state of a spiritual world. But there was one nation that took up the offer of God. Not in the sense directly, but indirectly. And who was that? The ancient Egyptians. Not all of them, some of them. When a lot of the Egyptians saw what was going on, and they realized the power of the Jewish God, of what it was, they said to themselves, I want to get on this thing too. They want all fools. You see, Power's an idiot. Power's the one who didn't mind fighting with God. But the rest of them saw there's a great bargain to be had over here. So many of them said, we want to go with the Jews. We want to leave Egypt with the Jews. This segment, who are really Egyptians, is called the Erev, or the mixed multitude. There were other nations that heard about what happened, and some people also drifted off and became part of the Jewish nation. So that by the time the Jews came to Sinai, they were the Jews, meaning the people who were descended from Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They were the pure Jews, and there was a whole bunch of other Goyim, Egyptians and some other sundry nations, that they decided to go along. And they said, we want to convert. We want to convert. We want to be Jewish too. The Bonishim told Moshe, don't take them. Don't allow them to become part of the Jewish nation. Because the Bonishim saw, very simply, that these people were very different than Jews. Why? The Jews had the soul, or they had the what? They had the spark of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. The genetic forefathers of the Jews were tremendous tzaddikim who devoted their entire life to the Bonishim. That effort distilled itself in the soul, so that the children of these forefathers were very holy people also. But the Egyptians and all the other people who wanted to become Jews, their forefathers were Egyptians. You see, were all the regular people who worshipped idols, and so on and so forth. It was a different stock, a different type of stock. But Moshe said, no, we've got to give them a chance too. After all, you went around offering all the nations of the world, you can't do that. So the Moshe said to Moshe, okay, which is this, you see, okay, we'll let them become part of the Jews. And they did become part of the Jewish nation. They did. They became part of the Jewish nation. They were true converts. Look, if a guy today says, I want to be Jewish, and he's willing to go through all the effort of being Jewish, we accept him. We do. And he becomes a real Jew. It's the same thing. The same thing with all these people, who is called the Erev, or the mixed multitude. You see, this is essentially who these people are. They are Jews, but they are Jews who essentially were converts. And not the sense, when I mean converts, they weren't actually converts, because at that time there were no Jews technically. But they accepted the Torah and Har Sinai like the other Jews. Then they said, we will accept the 650 commandments. But their forefathers were Goyim, were Egyptians, and so on. Now, because of the fact that they were not descended from Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they were not accrued the same privileges as the Jews, because they didn't have, look, the Jews were in Egypt for 210 years to get the Torah. You know? And these guys are just walking out because they see suddenly what the situation is. They're not going to get the same thing the Jews are. It's ridiculous. But the Bonishim said, okay, we'll give them a chelik in the Torah, but they're not going to get the same thing. So therefore, there were many distinctions that the Anana covered. The clouds of glory never hovered over them. only over the Jews, and they were not part of the camp of the Israelites themselves. They were outside of the camp, you see. But slowly the distinctions between the two faded, and gradually they became into one nation. So that all the Jews who are descended today are either descended from what? From the Jews who came from Avraham and Yaakov, or Jews who came from the Erev. That's what it is. All Jews today come from one or the other.
Why not both?
Wait. The Jews, every Jew today either descends from an Erev or descends from Avraham and Yaakov. They don't descend from both because they can't. They're two separate origins. The Jews who were in Egypt for 210 years came from Avraham and Yaakov, and the Egyptians and the other people who converted, who actually became Jews, right? They come from the Egyptians. They're stock as a Goyim, but they became Jews, and over the years the distinctions faded. Now, is there any way we can know who becomes who what? Who comes from Avraham and Yaakov, who comes from Erev? That's not so simple. That is a very, very difficult thing. Wait, that's a very, very difficult thing, you see. Although it does say, it says in Pirkei Avos, that how can you tell somebody who comes from Avraham and Yaakov if you're Baishin, Lachmim, and Goyim Chasodim? The way you can tell a person who is descended from Avraham and Yaakov is if he is a person who is a Baishin, means that he's reserved. He's not a flamboyant, a very loud kind of person. Number one, he's reserved. He has a certain amount of what? Of reservation to his personality. Number one, if he's a lachmim, he's a person who has innate compassion. You see. And in Goyim Chasodim, he's a person who also does these good deeds to other people. Somebody who you see has these innate qualities in him means that he's got the neshama that came from Avraham and Yaakov. You see. But does that still really allow us a difference to tell? No, it's very, very hard to tell. It's really very difficult, especially now, when what? When the darkness is so great, and it's very hard to see anyone, you see. But there is a way to see an Erev. There is a way to see an Erev. There is a way, you see. It's subtle, you see. And that way is extremely critical, because that way has to do with the last exile of the Jews. The word exile in Hebrew is what? It's called golus. But there's another word in Hebrew called shibud. Shibud means oppression, you see. Shibud means oppression or yoke. I have listed to you all the yokes that Jews have to submit to if they don't do the proper mitzvahs. The last shibud, or the last yoke of oppression that the Jews have to submit, is the Erev. Now, how is it possible that the Erev now become a vessel nation to the Jews if they are the Jews themselves? It doesn't make sense, does it? How can one Jew oppress another Jew? And why would God appoint a certain class of Jews to oppress another class of Jews? Doesn't make much sense, does it? Now it does. Except that we have to go back to another point in history, an extremely critical point in history, that most of us really have no way of understanding. And it was at that point in history that the Erev was created as a shibud or as a vessel nation. Before then it didn't happen. What am I talking about? You see, let me just reiterate this again. The Jewish people as it is today really are divided into two different classes as relates to internal features or the inner souls. One class of Jews come from Avraham and Yaakov. The other class comes from the Erev, you see. Now, is that a difference as far as we're concerned between what they are as Jews? No. There is no distinction. As far as the Buddhism is concerned, both are Jews and everyone has to do the 630 mitzvahs and everyone has to keep the Torah. When the Buddhism accepted the Erev as Jews, he didn't make a distinction, really, in terms of what Jews were about. As far as he's concerned, they legitimately became Jews. So as far as their effort and their choice was, they became legitimately Jews.